Hello, and welcome to Sarastro's Painting. Today I'm going to be painting miniatures from Star Wars Armada. Star Wars Armada is a game that I've had on my shelf for a few years now, but only just got to the table. As you can see, the larger ships in the game actually come quite nicely painted. And towards the end of the video, I'll just be adding a few finishing touches, such as boosting the brightness of the thrusters, and maybe adding a few edge highlights. The main job here will be painting the 30 tiny X-Wings and TIE Fighters that you can see don't come painted at all. Now, these ships are tiny, so I'm not going to be aiming for display quality painting here, just a good tabletop standard to enhance the thematic enjoyment of the game. I also wanted to take this opportunity to try out some of the ArchiveX paints, which are of special interest to me as a Star Wars fan, because these are paints accurately colour matched to those used by Industrial Light and Magic for the models featured in the original Star Wars trilogy. But I will also be suggesting alternative colours from the more established paint ranges throughout the video. With that out of the way, let's begin. First, we need to prime the unpainted models, and I'd strongly suggest finding some way to secure them whilst doing so. I'm going to first spray the undersides of the ships, so here you can see that I'm sticking the TIE Fighters upside down on some white tack. You might find double-sided tape works just as well. I found that 3mm foam board works quite well for holding these X-Wings too. Here I'm just sliding the upper two laser cannons into the foam. I'm now going to prime the figures in black using Badger's Stynel Res Black Primer, which I'm thinning with just a little thinner to help prevent blockages. Equally, you could use the Vallejo airbrush primer, or indeed a rattle can primer if you don't have an airbrush. And there'd also be nothing wrong with priming in grey here too. Once dry, I'm now turning the ships the right way up to hit the rest of the model, and I'm simply mounting these to the foam board by pressing the node on the underside into the foam. A little white tack can also be used to help secure the models in place if needed. Next, I'm also going to use the airbrush to apply the main base colours, and for the X-Wings I'm using Reefer White, which is a slightly warm off-white, somewhere in between pure white and something like Scalecolor's nacre. Here we can see that the paint has quite a thick creamy consistency and nice opaque coverage. For the airbrush, however, I'm going to have to thin it down with some thinner if I want to avoid blockages. Here I'm just checking the consistency. I'm now providing the base colour for the X-Wings in a couple of thin layers. I don't mind if the undersides end up being slightly darker, but I do want solid, bright coverage for the rest. A latex glove would be handy here if you haven't just run out as I have. For the TIE Fighters, I'm aiming for the more bluish look from episodes 5 and 6, and for that I'm using Stormy Sea. This paint has quite a subtle hue, but mixing something like anthracite grey with some white will get you pretty close, as you can see here. With that done, I'm now going to paint the remaining base colours and additional details. Starting with the TIE Fighters, I'm going to paint all of the wing panels black, and you could use whatever black paint you like for this. I'm using Scalecolor's Art Black because it has strong coverage and I like the slightly off-matte finish. Other good choices that I also tried include the Vallejo Model Colour Black and the Pro-Aquarel Coal Black. These panels on the outer surface are fairly easy to do, as we can just push the brush up to the raised struts. That being said, you could do things the other way around and base coat in black first, then paint the struts with the Stormy Sea afterwards if you prefer. I'm now just masking the upper part of one of the stands where I'll be mounting the TIE fighters to get to the inner sides of the wings. This is a bit more tricky as the struts aren't actually sculpted here. Once again, you could also paint the whole area black, then paint the struts on top if you find that easier. Or indeed leave the entire inner wings plain black if you really want to save time. I certainly went back and forth a bit to achieve an acceptable level of neatness here. Once the panels are done, I'm now tidying the edges of each wing. And to create the borders, I'm simply using the side of the brush at a roughly 45-degree angle. The painting here doesn't need to be immaculately neat, as it's the matte effect that we're really aiming for. Next I'm going to paint the cockpits using dark Reefer Grey, which is very close to Scalecolor's graphite, or even Vallejo's cold grey. This is another step that you could actually skip if you really want to get the models to the table in a hurry. Next I've chosen to shade the body of the TIE fighters using a 2-to-1 mix of Nuln Oil and Drakenhof Nightshade to create some quick and easy depth and definition in the recesses. And here I'm just using some black to further darken the portholes before mounting the ships to see how things look. To finish things off, I've decided to add a few quick highlights to the edges of the wings by lightening the Stormy Sea with some Reefer White. You can see I'm hitting the upper edge of each wing along with the angled joints, just to make the structure pop a little more on the tabletop. And this completes the TIE fighters. Moving on to the X-Wings, I'm first going to add the red markings. A couple of different red tones can be seen in the movies, mirrored in the ArchiveX range with the lovely 1975 Caboose Red and SP Daylight Red. Either of these would look great, and I ended up going with the SP Daylight Red, believed to be the colour used for the Red 3 X-Wing. This is quite an orangey red, which you could also achieve with something like Aldebaran Red mixed with a little Mars Orange. And the Caboose Red has a cooler tone, sitting somewhere between Antares Red and Blood Red, for example. I'm first drawing the stripes along the side of the ship, just above the central seam. For most ships this line is broken up, which we can do quite easily with the off-white base tone. I'm now approximating the red markings on the tops of the wings, making corrections as I go. You might even want to add some small stripes corresponding to the individual ship's call sign. and I just added 1, 2 or 3 as the space is so limited. Some of the ships also have a touch of red on the thrusters. Once again, we don't need to be immaculately neat here, as there's only so much detail that we'll actually see at this scale from a normal gaming distance. For the touches of yellow, I'm using Reefer Yellow, which is pretty close to something like Citadel's Uriel Yellow. Here I'm adding a small accent to each laser cannon, just using a single layer as I'm not aiming for full saturation. We can often see a touch of yellow on each of the lower wings, as well as a couple of patches on the top of the nose. Next I'm going to paint the cockpits, using a dark grey mixed from black and dark Reefer grey. And here I'm mixing a pale cool grey tone for the trim, using Stormy Sea, Reefer Grey and Reefer White. This is pretty optional however. Whilst it's possible to draw on some beams here, I ended up not bothering for most of the ships. We can also hit the little astromech droid with some grey too. Finally, I'm darkening the thruster intakes with dark grey or black. I'm now going to begin adding some pretty heavy weathering, starting with a 2-to-1 mix of Nuln Oil and Lahmian medium. I'm coating the entire ship with this, then brushing the excess from places like the top of the nose. This would actually be a fine place to stop with the weathering if you like. I've chosen to go a bit further with some additional Nuln Oil for the engine and thruster area. I also decided to have a little play with the Tamiya black panel liner to create some additional depth in the recesses. This has its own brush applicator and flows incredibly well, although I think it's a product that is best used with models with more clearly defined recesses and grooves. There's a wide range of other colours we could thin down and use to add further bits of weathering and colour modulation, although I think at this scale we're getting diminishing returns for our efforts. I am however using some Reefer White, darkened here with a little dark grime, to add a few highlights, especially to the laser cannons, and to help hide some of the mould lines revealed by the shade we added earlier. Finally, I'm dabbing on some pure white onto each of the thrusters at the back, followed with some fluorescent magenta mixed with a little red. I'm now attaching the ships to the bases and providing a few final highlights. With the 30 tiny ships complete, I'm now going to add a few finishing touches to the larger ships. For the Star Destroyer, I first decided to maximise the brightness of the thrusters by spraying on some pure white ink, and then introducing some turquoise to achieve my desired level of saturation. This is of course very optional, however. I'm now mixing some turquoise with the white to achieve the hue that I'm after. I don't mind too much if some of this hits the surrounding area. Finally, I'm thinning some white paint down with medium and dropping it into the centre of each thruster. I'm also dropping this around the sides, letting the paint flow into the centre. Depending on how far you thinned the white, it might take several layers to achieve the desired level of brightness. I'm also using the same tones to brighten the thrusters of the Nebulon B. And for the Corvette, I'm first applying some opaque white, just like I did with the X-Wings. And then going over this with some Fluorescent Red mixed with a little yellow. We can then brighten up the centre of each thruster with a little white. And finally, I added a little fluorescent yellow on top. For my final tweak, I decided to add a few edge highlights to the Destroyer using ILM DS Surface Grey. This is quite a bright, slightly warm grey tone, just a shade lighter than something like Citadel's Administratum Grey. And this completes the Star Wars Armada core set. Thank you so much for watching, I hope you've enjoyed the episode. As usual, you'll find a full product list with links in the video description, along with links to all of the places I can be found online. My very special thanks as always go to my amazing patrons for funding this video. If you'd like to help support what I do, you can find out more by hitting the Patreon link. Join me again soon, and happy painting!